At my grandson's 1-month celebration, I gave him a wooden horse I'd spent weeks carving by hand. My daughter-in-law tossed it aside like it was trash. My son just laughed and said, "He's just a carpenter, babe." I quietly picked it up and left. The next morning, I called my lawyer. His secretary went pale. "You need to come in right now. He's here." As we dive into today's story, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Note, this story is fictional, created for entertainment and learning. Any similarities are coincidental, but the message is meaningful. Let's see what unfolds. The late afternoon sun of a Saturday in October didn't just shine through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrogate Club. It interrogated everything it touched. It caught the sharp edges of the crystal chandeliers, the precise placement of the white lilies, and the expensive sheen on the faces of 65 guests. This was a room built for people who never had to check the price tag of their own dignity. I stood at the entrance for a moment, holding a bundle wrapped in heavy, unbleached canvas. It felt heavy in my arms, not because of its weight, but because of the hours I'd spent carving it in the quiet of my garage. It was a wooden rocking horse walnut wood, sanded until it felt like silk. No paint, no plastic. Just the smell of the forest and the work of a man's hands. The room smelled of expensive perfume and catered salmon. It was a cold smell. "Dad, you're here," Danny said. He didn't come over to hug me. He just stopped a few feet away, his drink held like a shield. His eyes flicked down to the canvas-wrapped bundle in my arms, and for a split second I saw a flash of something that looked like a wince. "You could have just left the gift at the front desk with the others. They're organizing them by size." "I wanted to carry it," I said. My voice sounded like gravel hitting a silk sheet in this room. He didn't argue. He just nodded toward a table at the far end of the hall where Serena was sitting. She looked like a porcelain doll in a dress that probably cost more than my first truck. Maggie Whitfield, her mother, sat beside her, presiding over the event like a queen mother at a coronation. I walked through the crowd. No one looked at me. Yet I felt every eye in the room documenting the fact that my suit was 10 years old and my hands were stained with wood oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. When it came time for the gifts, the room went quiet. It was a performance. Serena opened boxes of designer baby clothes, silver rattles from Tiffany's, and high-tech monitors that could probably track a heartbeat from the moon. Every gift was met with a chorus of oohs and ahs. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward and unwrapped the canvas. The rocking horse stood there on the velvet tablecloth, looking out of place like a timber wolf in a kennel of poodles. I'd carved the mane to look like it was catching the wind. I'd spent 3 nights just on the eyes. "It's walnut," I said simply. "For the boy." Serena picked it up. She didn't look at the craftsmanship. She didn't feel the balance of the rockers. She held it for maybe 3 seconds, gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile you give a waiter who brought the wrong order, and set it down on the very edge of the table. "How rustic," she murmured. Maggie Whitfield reached out. She didn't grab the horse. She touched the wooden ear with 2 fingers the way someone might touch a piece of trash they found on their porch. She didn't say a word, but her expression said everything. It said that this object was dirty. It said that it didn't belong in the nursery of a Whitfield heir. The silence in the room began to stretch. It grew heavy, suffocating. Danny stepped up beside his wife. He looked at the horse, then at the guests, then finally at me. He didn't look like my son. He looked like a man who had successfully scrubbed his past clean and suddenly found a stubborn stain he couldn't get out. "Honestly, Dad," Danny said, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the Harrogate Club, "we have a specific aesthetic for the nursery. We're not running a pioneer museum. Maybe next time just stick to the registry. It would save everyone the awkwardness. A few people chuckled. Most just looked away, embarrassed for me, or perhaps just bored by the sight of a man who didn't know his place. I didn't say anything. I didn't get angry. I didn't feel the need to explain that the walnut came from the tree in the backyard of the house where Danny had learned to ride a bike. I just stood there. I sat in my chair for 10 more minutes. I watched them move on to the next gift, a motorized baby cradle that cost $4,000. No one spoke to me. No one offered me a drink. To the 65 people in that room, I had become part of the furniture, and not the expensive kind. I stood up. I walked to the gift table. I didn't look at Danny or Serena. I picked up the wooden horse, wrapped it back in the heavy canvas, and tucked it under my arm. I walked out of the Harrogate Club. The valet didn't even rush to get my car. He took his time, sensing I wasn't the type to tip $20 for a 30-second drive. I sat in the driver's seat of my Ford, the engine idling roughly. The rocking horse sat on the passenger seat beside me, its wooden eyes staring at the dashboard. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to. I pulled out of the parking lot and started the drive home. My mind drifted away from the chandeliers and the perfume. I thought about my study at home. I thought about the fireproof steel cabinet I had bolted to the floor years ago, hidden in the far corner behind the winter coats. Nobody in that room knew what was inside that cabinet. Danny certainly didn't. He thought he knew exactly who I was, a retired carpenter with nothing left to give but rustic toys. I looked at the horse one last time before turning onto the main road. Pioneer Museum. I whispered to the empty car. I began to drive, and for the first time in years, I started planning. The overhead bulb flickered as the aluminum garage door rolled up, casting a pale yellow glow over the concrete floor. The familiar scent of pine dust and motor oil washed over me the moment I stepped out of the truck. It was a sharp, honest smell, a jarring contrast to the sterile, perfumed air I had choked on hours earlier. I carried the canvas bundle inside, unwrapped the fabric, and lifted the wooden rocking horse. I placed it back on the third shelf above the workbench. It settled perfectly into the faint circular ring of clean sawdust it had occupied for 3 solid weeks before today. Inside the house, the silence was different. It wasn't the heavy, judgmental quiet of a high society banquet hall. It was the settled, deep quiet of a home that had witnessed both extraordinary love and profound loss. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and filled the kettle. Steeping black tea at 10 o'clock at night was a routine etched into my bones, a 30-year habit that kept my hands busy when my mind threatened to wander. As the water began to heat, my eyes drifted to the framed photograph resting on the windowsill. Carol. She had been gone since 1998. Yet there were still mornings I woke up expecting to hear her soft footsteps on the hardwood floor. She was only 36 when the lung cancer aggressively claimed her. We were a young family, and we didn't have the kind of gold-plated corporate health insurance that shields you from ruin. In America, getting critically ill without the right paperwork is often a financial death sentence. The endless rounds of radiation and chemotherapy drained our meager savings in months. Then we maxed out every line of credit we could find, and finally we had to take out a second mortgage on this very house just to keep her comfortable at the end. When her heart finally stopped beating, she left behind a shattered husband, an 8-year-old boy, and a terrifying mountain of medical debt. I remember the night after we buried her. It was raining a cold, relentless November downpour. I had tucked Danny into his bed, promising him that his mother was finally resting without pain. Then I walked out to the garage, sat on an overturned paint bucket, and just stared at the walls. My pockets were empty. The collection agencies were already circling. I picked up a steel framing hammer, feeling the cold weight of it in my palm, wondering how a man with just a high school diploma and calloused fingers was supposed to keep a roof over his grieving son's head. That night could have broken me. It breaks a lot of men. But as I sat there in the dark, listening to the rain hit the aluminum roof, I made a choice. I didn't reach for a bottle. I didn't run away. I gripped the handle of that hammer until my knuckles turned white and made a silent promise to the empty room. I was going to survive, and I was going to build a foundation for my boy, no matter how many hours it took. And I did. For 26 years, I drove my truck to the Crestfield Senior Village. 5 days a week, rain or shine, clocking in at 5 in the morning and out at 2 in the afternoon. I was the head maintenance carpenter for a community of 90 elderly residents. I fixed sagging doors, replaced corroded copper pipes, and built custom oak shelving for widows who missed the large homes they had left behind. To the corporate administration, I was just a reliable hourly employee, but to the residents I was something else. They baked me pies. They asked me about my son's grades. They simply called me Our Bob. It was honest, back-breaking work that destroyed my joints and permanently stained my hands. Absolutely no one there ever looked at my faded flannel shirts and mistook me for a millionaire. The sharp whistle of the kettle pulled me back to the present. I poured the boiling water into a mug and walked over to the kitchen counter. I pulled open the top drawer, the one filled with mismatched silverware, old hardware store receipts, and loose batteries. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a faded Polaroid picture. It was Carol standing in our front yard, holding a gap-toothed, laughing Danny. I traced my rough thumb over Danny's young face. He had looked at me with such pure admiration back then. To that little boy, his father was a hero who could fix anything that was broken. I set the Polaroid down on the counter next to my tea. I looked away from the photograph and turned my gaze toward the narrow hallway. At the very end of it, shrouded in shadows, was the solid oak door leading to the storage room. It had been a very long time since I had stepped foot in that dusty room. It had been even longer since I had thought about unlocking the old metal cabinet I had not opened in years. The hallway was dark, but I didn't need a light to find my way to the storage room door. My mind was already pulling me away from the quiet house of 2024, dragging me backward through the years. Walking down that narrow corridor, I thought about the smooth, unblemished walnut rocking horse currently sitting out in the garage. Looking back at it now, the flawless finish felt entirely wrong. The very first one had been different. It was born out of pure desperation. It was the dead of winter, roughly 3 months after we buried Carol. The frost had settled hard over Crestfield City, but the real freezing temperatures were inside our home. 8-year-old Danny had turned into a ghost. He had stopped talking altogether. He pushed his meals around his plate until the food grew cold, and he spent his afternoons staring blankly out the living room window, waiting for a car that was never going to pull into the driveway again. I had taken him to Dr. Miller, a seasoned pediatrician who had known my boy since birth. The doctor had been gentle but firm, explaining that this was profound childhood depression triggered by severe trauma. He said Danny needed time, a stable routine, and an anchor to hold on to while the storm passed. But Dr. Miller couldn't tell me how a father drowning in his own grief was supposed to build an anchor out of thin air. I didn't have a degree in psychology. I didn't know how to navigate complex emotional landscapes. The only thing I understood was how to shape things that were solid. On a particularly bitter night in February, unable to listen to the agonizing silence of the house any longer, I walked out to the freezing workspace. I flicked the switch, and a single bare incandescent bulb illuminated the freezing air. My breath plumed in the cold. I bypassed the standard lumber and went straight to the back corner. Hidden under a tarp was a massive weathered block of old-growth pine. It had belonged to my father, Henry. He was a stoic man, a factory line worker, who spoke through his actions rather than his words. Before a sudden stroke took his life years ago, he had handed me this piece of timber, claiming he was saving it for something important, but never got around to figuring out what that was. I placed Henry's pine block on the workbench. I grabbed my carving tools and went to work. The silence of the freezing night was broken only by the rhythmic, aggressive sound of the steel rasp tearing through raw wood. The sharp, clean scent of cut pine filled the enclosed space, battling the stale smell of motor oil. I didn't draft a blueprint. I just cut. I chiseled with a frantic energy, trying to carve the grief out of my own chest and trap it in the timber. Hours bled into one another. Somewhere around 3 a.m, my chisel slipped. A jagged splinter drove deep under the thumbnail of my left hand. Blood welled up instantly, smearing across the pale wood of the horse's developing mane. I didn't stop to bandage it. I just wiped my hand on my jeans and kept carving. I didn't sleep a single wink. When the gray light of dawn finally crept through the frosted window pane, it was finished. It wasn't elegant. It was rough-hewn, chunky, and the proportions were slightly off. The reddish-brown stain on the mane was still faintly visible. I carried it inside my joints, aching my hands, trembling from exhaustion. I quietly pushed open Danny's bedroom door. He was curled up under his blankets, his small face pale against the pillows. I placed the crude pine horse on the rug right beside his bed and retreated to the doorway to wait. 20 minutes later, he stirred. He rubbed his eyes, sat up, and looked down at the floor. He stared at the wooden figure for a long time. Then very slowly, he slid out of bed and reached out to touch the rough ears, and then it happened. The corners of his mouth twitched. A fragile, genuine smile broke across his face, the first expression of joy I had witnessed in 90 agonizing days. Standing in the shadow of the doorframe, feeling the sting of my bleeding thumb, I looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Okay, Carol, I know what to do." The memory faded as the brass doorknob of the storage room turned under my grip. I was back in 2024. The air in this forgotten room was stale, smelling of old paper and dust. I walked past stacked cardboard boxes and a broken vacuum cleaner until I reached the back wall. There it stood, the heavy olive-drab fireproof filing cabinet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small brass key I hadn't used in a very long time. As my fingers brushed against the cold steel of the lock, another echo from the past surfaced in my mind. It was my father Henry sitting on our porch decades ago, smoking his pipe. "Son," he had asked, his voice low and gravelly, "what do you want to leave behind after you're gone?" I inserted the key. The heavy internal tumblers let out a loud, definitive clack. I gripped the thick handle and pulled the heavy steel drawer open with a long, metallic hiss. The heavy steel drawer rolled outward with a metallic groan, releasing a trapped scent of old parchment and dry air into the dim room. Looking down into the depths of that metal belly, my father's gravelly voice echoed again in the confined space. "What do you want to leave behind after you're gone?" I had purchased this olive-drab behemoth in the late fall of 2001. Watching the world fundamentally change over a few terrifying September days had taught me a brutal lesson. Nothing in this life is permanent, and the only structures that survive a sudden collapse are the foundations you reinforce yourself. A single beam of light from the hallway illuminated the top tier. Inside sat a pristine row of thick manila folders, 41 of them. Each one contained a stamped, notarized warranty deed. They were arranged with meticulous precision, alphabetized by county and zoning district across the state. Next to the real estate files were heavy binders filled with monthly statements for tax-free municipal bonds and a highly diversified portfolio of blue-chip equities. The bottom drawer housed the corporate veil. It held the state-certified articles of organization for an entity operating under the name RBC Holdings LLC, Robert B. Calloway. That was the invisible architect. That was me. I reached in and pulled out a handful of the folders, though not to audit the numbers. I knew the math by heart. I touched them to feel the history woven into the paper. That sprawling commercial lot in the valley had been purchased with the brutal overtime I worked during the record-breaking blizzard of 2004. The downtown apartment complex was the direct result of flipping bank foreclosures while running on 3 hours of sleep, my hands bleeding under heavy work gloves. Every signature on these deeds was paid for with sweat and isolation. As I shifted the files, my fingers brushed against a solitary, heavy-stock document tucked into a protective sleeve at the very back of the drawer. I pulled it out into the faint light. It wasn't a property title, and it wasn't a stock certificate. I stared at the embossed seal and the formal typography for a long, quiet minute, tracing the raised ink with my rough thumb. This single page carried a weight far heavier than all the concrete and acreage combined. Without opening it fully, I carefully slid it back into its hidden sanctuary. If a forensic accountant were to tally up the current market value of the assets resting inside this cabinet, the final figure would hover right around $34 million. It was an empire forged entirely in the shadows, built penny by penny, nail by nail, from the meager wages of a Crestfield senior village maintenance man over 26 years of unbroken silence. I pushed the heavy drawer shut. The steel latch engaged with a resounding, undeniable click. I didn't stand up. Instead, I let my shoulders slump, sliding my back down the rough plaster wall until I hit the cold floorboards. I sat there in the dark, pulling my knees up. The crushing pressure suddenly bearing down on my chest wasn't physical exhaustion. It was the terrifying gravity of the weapon I had spent decades forging, and the absolute certainty of the destruction it was about to cause. Across the shadowy room, a small framed photograph of Carol hung slightly crooked near the doorframe. I looked up at her familiar, smiling face barely visible in the gloom. "My love," I whispered to the empty air, my voice cracking just a fraction. "Our son is living his entire life on the estate of a man he absolutely despises. It's time." The following morning, long before the sun even considered rising over the horizon, I woke up with a brand new routine. The momentum born from a freezing night of sheer willpower in my late 30s carried me straight into the spring of 2000. I was 40 years old, running on coffee and a singular, unshakable focus. If I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress around my son, a weekly maintenance paycheck wasn't going to pour the concrete. During a lunch break at the senior center, a fellow tradesman mentioned a ruined foreclosed property over in the Millbrook district. It was a neighborhood most investors actively avoided, a forgotten stretch of town plagued by empty storefronts and overgrown lawns. The bank was desperate to unload a specific 2-bedroom unit for $58,000. I walked into the local branch of the Crestfield Community Bank the very next morning. I sat across from Paul Dreyer, the branch manager. Paul was a pragmatic man who appreciated calloused hands and steady employment. I laid out 6 years of meticulously hoarded savings and asked him to finance the rest. He looked at my worn boots, looked at my pristine credit score, and slid the mortgage paperwork across his desk. The Millbrook house was a disaster. The roof leaked, the drywall was rotting, and the plumbing was shot. But I didn't have the budget to hire a crew. I had to become the crew. That was when I met Gene McAllister. Gene was a retired, foul-mouthed general contractor who spent his twilight years running the counter at an independent builder's supply yard on the edge of town. Gene didn't suffer fools, but if you bought your lumber and copper pipes from him, he would sketch out electrical schematics and plumbing layouts on the back of torn receipts. He taught me the brutal mathematics of structural load and the dark arts of pulling permits in this county. He was a grumbling, chain-smoking professor, and his hardware store was my university. I didn't do it alone. Danny, 10 years old and swimming in a pair of oversized denim overalls, was my right-hand man. We spent our weekends in that ruined house. While his classmates were playing video games or going to theme parks, my boy was learning how to sort galvanized nails and tape off baseboards for painting. There were countless Sunday evenings when I would carry a sleeping Danny to my truck, his small face smeared with drywall dust, having passed out on a drop cloth in a half-finished living room. Back then, he loved the grime. He loved being part of the process. But he never saw the paperwork. Every deed, every mortgage document, every corporate filing was processed under the name RBC Holdings, a name I never once mentioned to my son. As the years passed and Danny built his own life, I never corrected his assumption that the Millbrook house had simply been sold off. Some foundations are strongest when they are invisible. 7 months later, the Millbrook house was finished. I found a reliable mechanic and his family to rent it. Their monthly payment covered the bank loan, the property taxes, and left exactly $112 in profit. It was a meager spark, but it was enough to start a fire. I took that equity, went back to Paul Dreyer, and bought a second rundown property 3 years later, then a third. My strategy was agonizingly slow, but mathematically inevitable. While other men upgraded their trucks or took their families on cruises, I wore the same threadbare flannel jackets. If my boots sprang a leak, I patched them with roofing tape. Every single spare dime was driven relentlessly back into real estate. By the time Danny graduated college in 2012, I owned 15 units. By early 2020, that number had swelled to 35. When the global pandemic struck and the world economy locked its doors, panic ripped through the rental market. Corporate landlords immediately sent out aggressive eviction notices. I took a different route. I sat down at my kitchen table, called every single family living in one of my properties, and told them the same thing: keep your money for groceries. Nobody is losing their home. We will figure it out when the dust settles. I didn't raise rent a single cent during those terrifying 2 years, and not a single family abandoned my leases. Through it all, I never quit my day job. I still clocked in at 5 in the morning to fix leaky faucets for the elderly. Danny, who was rapidly climbing the corporate ladder by then, used to beg me to retire, embarrassed by my occupation. But he didn't understand. Wealth cannot teach a man dignity. Only labor does. I remember the evening I finished that very first Millbrook house. The yard was cleared, the trim was painted a crisp, blinding white, and I had planted a small row of hydrangeas near the porch. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, wiping sweat from my brow, looking at a decaying structure I had resurrected with my own 2 hands. I looked up at the twilight sky, exhausted to my marrow, and imagined Carol standing next to me. I knew she would have been proud. Decades passed in a blur of escrow documents and building code inspections. By late 2020, I was sitting in Paul Dreyer's office once again, signing the final closing documents for my 40th property. Paul, now sporting silver hair, shook his head in absolute disbelief at the empire we had quietly assembled. As I stood up to leave, my eyes drifted to a corkboard near Paul's door, where the bank pinned unique commercial listings. My gaze locked onto a glossy brochure pinned to the dead center of the board. It wasn't a duplex. It wasn't an apartment complex. It was an entirely different class of asset sitting on prime commercial acreage. I read the name printed in bold black letters across the top of the flyer, and my breath hitched in my chest. I stopped walking entirely. The screen door of my kitchen squeaked open on a sweltering July afternoon in 2019. I turned from the sink, wiping my hands on a dish towel, expecting to see my boy. In my mind's eye, a part of me was always braced to see that 10-year-old kid in oversized denim holding a hammer he could barely lift. Instead, a 29-year-old man stepped over the threshold, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit like armor. And on his arm was Serena. She offered a polite, measured greeting. Her voice was smooth, trained, and perfectly pleasant. But as I offered her a glass of iced tea, I watched her eyes. They moved over my faded wallpaper, the scuffed linoleum floor, and the chipped Formica countertops. It wasn't a glare of disgust. It was the clinical, sweeping assessment of an auditor. She was calculating the net worth of my life, and she clearly found the final number to be deeply unimpressive. I didn't feel anger right then. I just felt a quiet, primal shift in the air, a sudden warning signal. What broke my heart wasn't Serena's subtle judgment. It was how Danny reacted to it. Whenever she was in the room, my son fundamentally altered his own gravity. He stood a little straighter, his vocabulary became unnaturally polished, and his genuine, booming laugh was replaced by a tight, rehearsed chuckle. He was constantly looking at her from the corner of his eye, seeking approval for the environment he had come from. That afternoon was the beginning of a very long, very slow, disappearing act. Losing a child to another life doesn't usually happen with a dramatic slamming of doors. It happens through 100 tiny, silent withdrawals. First, the casual weekend drop-ins vanished entirely by 2020. Then the phone calls shifted from sprawling conversations about his career to brief, 10-minute check-ins scheduled neatly on his commute. By the summer of 2021, we were at their wedding. The Whitfield family had orchestrated the entire affair at a sprawling country estate in the Hudson Valley. It was a masterpiece of extreme wealth and rigid social choreography. Maggie Whitfield floated through the reception, like a reigning monarch, ensuring every detail was flawless. When the time came for the reception speeches, the father of the bride spoke for 20 minutes. The best man, a hedge fund analyst, gave a toasted PowerPoint presentation. I sat at table 6, far from the head table, sipping sparkling water. A week prior, Danny had taken me out for a quick coffee to explain that the wedding planner had a very strict, curated format, and there simply wouldn't be a window for me to give a toast. I had nodded and told him not to worry about it. The distance widened into a chasm the following year. It was Thanksgiving of 2022. I had bought a small turkey, expecting Danny to come over for at least a few hours in the morning. He called me on Tuesday evening. "Dad." His voice crackled over the line, laced with a heavy dose of hesitation. "Listen, Maggie and Richard are hosting a huge dinner this year at their place in the Hamptons. They want me there the whole weekend." He paused, taking a breath. "I'd ask you to come, but you know how they are. They're a bit traditional. The crowd is going to be mostly investors and politicians. Honestly, you wouldn't be comfortable, Dad." He wasn't protecting me from them. He was protecting them from me. "Okay, son," I said. My voice was entirely level. I didn't argue. I didn't guilt him. I simply absorbed the blow. "Have a good trip. Drive safe." I hung up the phone and sat alone in my kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The final definitive fracture happened just a few months ago on his 34th birthday. I had always called him at exactly 8 in the morning, a tradition we had kept since he went off to college. This year, it went straight to his voicemail. I left a brief, warm message and went to work at the senior village. The hours crawled by. Noon, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Finally, at noon, my phone vibrated in my pocket. "Dad, hey!" Danny said. I could hear the aggressive clacking of a computer keyboard in the background. He was speaking at a frantic pace, his tone stretched thin with irritation. "I got your voicemail, thanks. Look, I'm absolutely swamped right now. We've got a massive merger closing, and Serena is blowing up my other line about some gala tickets. Can we do this another time?" He sounded like a man swatting away a persistent, annoying insect. "Of course," I said quietly. "Happy birthday, Danny." I ended the call. I didn't put the phone back in my pocket immediately. I just stood on my back porch, looking out at the detached garage. Through the dusty window pane, I could just barely see the outline of a small, battered wooden stool sitting in the corner, the exact spot where a little boy used to sit for hours, proudly sorting nails for his father. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I didn't know it at that exact moment, but while I was standing there mourning the ghost of my son across town in a high-end coffee shop, Serena was sitting down for a private, hushed meeting, and the person sitting across from her was someone I would have never ever expected. The alarm clock on my nightstand clicked an audible warning a fraction of a second before the buzzer sounded at exactly 4:45 a.m. I reached out in the dark and silenced it. Sliding out of bed, I pulled on my heavy canvas work pants and a faded navy blue shirt, bearing the Crestfield Senior Village logo over the breast pocket. The phantom chill of a certain high society banquet hall still lingered in my bones, a lingering cold that a hot shower couldn't quite wash away. But Sunday mornings didn't care about personal history. The pipes still needed checking. I pulled into the employee parking lot long before the sun crested the horizon. Jim, the weekend shift supervisor, was already brewing a pot of industrial-strength coffee in the break room. We exchanged a brief, silent nod. Men who work the early shift rarely waste energy on small talk before dawn. I grabbed my tool belt and started my rounds. The routine was a physical meditation. I tightened a stubbornly squeaky brass hinge on room 14, where old Mr. Kowalski slept. I dragged a stepladder down hallway B to replace a flickering fluorescent bulb that had been driving the night nurses crazy. And I spent an hour in the third-floor utility closet bleeding the air out of the main heating system. By 8 o'clock, the dining hall began to fill with the soft murmur of waking residents. "Good morning, Bob." The greetings came from every table. I knew them all. I knew that Mr. Kowalski preferred his door handle turned a specific way due to arthritis, and I knew exactly which windows drafted cold air in the winter. Near the coffee station, I ran into Mrs. Patterson. She was a 79-year-old retired schoolteacher with a gentle smile and hands that showed decades of grading papers and kneading bread dough. "Bob, look," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she pulled a pair of reading glasses from her cardigan. She handed me a printed photograph. My granddaughter just delivered her first baby late last night, a healthy little girl. I looked at the picture. The young mother in the photo looked exhausted, lying in a standard hospital bed, but her eyes held a pure, radiant joy. There were no crystal chandeliers in the background, no catered salmon, no perfectly curated guest lists, just the raw, honest miracle of a new life. "She's beautiful, Mrs. Patterson," I said softly, handing the photo back. "You must be incredibly proud." "Oh, I am," she beamed, clutching the picture to her chest. "We don't have much to give them, but we have a whole lot of love ready for that little one." I watched her walk away, and a sudden sharp clarity hit me. I looked at the worn linoleum floor of the senior center and thought about the woman who had married my son. Serena and her family lived in an entirely different stratosphere, throwing lavish, meticulously orchestrated events, funded by an economy built on the backs of honest, hard-working people just like Mrs. Patterson. And they looked down on the dirt beneath their polished shoes without ever realizing that the dirt was holding up their entire world. At noon, I retreated to my basement workshop to eat a sandwich. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and set it on the workbench. The screen lit up, displaying 3 unread text messages from Danny. I didn't open them. I didn't even read the previews. My eyes drifted to the top shelf above the industrial sander. The cedar test piece I had carved weeks ago sat there in the dim light, its rough proportions a silent reminder of the finished walnut horse now sitting in my garage. As I stared at the unfinished wood, the heavy knot in my chest finally untangled. The decision I had wrestled with through the night crystallized into absolute certainty. This was not about vengeance. Vengeance is a poison a man drinks, hoping the other person dies. This was about a quarantine. It was a calculated decision to protect a $34 million legacy of blood sweat and sacrifice from being consumed by someone who would laugh at the hands that built it. My shift ended at 2 in the afternoon. I drove home, took a shower, and put on a clean button-down shirt. At exactly 5 o'clock, I sat at my kitchen table, opened my contacts, and dialed the number for Jerry Sutton. Jerry wasn't a billboard lawyer. He was a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney who had meticulously managed the legal architecture of RBC Holdings since 2002. He was the only person on earth besides myself who knew the entire scope of the empire. The line barely rang once before it clicked open. "Jerry, it's Bob," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need you to do something, today if possible. I need to initiate the transfer protocols we discussed a few years back." There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. For a man who billed by the minute, Jerry rarely paused. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "Bob, I need you to come down to my office immediately." "I can come tomorrow morning," I replied, frowning. "Is there a problem with the paperwork?" "No, it's not the paperwork," Jerry said, his tone dropping an octave. "I need you here because I received a very specific phone call yesterday afternoon, and it's something you need to know about right now." The dying light of late Sunday afternoon bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jerry Sutton's downtown office, casting long, geometric shadows across his massive mahogany desk. I had been working with Jerry for 22 years. We didn't do waiting rooms, and we didn't do receptionists. I walked straight past the empty secretarial pool and pushed his heavy glass door open. Jerry was standing by his credenza, pouring 2 fingers of neat bourbon into a crystal glass. He was a sharp-featured, meticulously tailored man who looked exactly like what he was, an apex predator in a 3-piece suit. He slid the glass across the desk toward me and sat down heavily in his leather chair. "Yesterday afternoon, right around 3:30, Jerry began, not wasting a single second on pleasantries. My private line rang. The receptionist was gone for the weekend, so it routed directly to my desk. 3:30. I did the math in my head. That was roughly an hour after I had walked out of the Harrogate Club with the wooden horse tucked under my arm. "It was a woman," Jerry continued, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "She introduced herself as Serena Whitfield Calloway. She wanted to schedule an immediate consultation regarding a delicate family matter." I took a slow sip of the bourbon. It burned on the way down, a sharp contrast to the sudden icy stillness settling in my chest. "Go on." She asked me to outline the exact legal framework required to establish an involuntary financial conservatorship, Jerry said, his eyes locking onto mine. She claimed her father-in-law was exhibiting severe signs of cognitive decline and erratic behavior. She wanted to know how quickly a judge could declare you legally incompetent, strip you of your financial autonomy, and grant her and her husband full power of attorney. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating, lasting a full 30 seconds. Serena wasn't just embarrassed by my existence. She wasn't simply trying to keep me away from her social circles. She was actively moving to neutralize me. She wanted to lock me in a legal cage, take control of the modest suburban house she thought was my only asset, and ensure I could never be a variable in her perfect curated life ever again. And in her absolute arrogance, she had searched for the most ruthless, high-priced corporate litigator in Crestfield City to do the job. She had looked at a directory, picked the biggest shark in the water, and unwittingly dialed the direct number of the man who held the keys to my $34 million empire. Jerry reached into his desk drawer and tossed a thin manila folder onto the mahogany surface. "She also asked me to run a preliminary public asset search on you, just to see what they would be dealing with when the court order went through." Jerry said, a cold, mocking smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, she handed her entire playbook straight to the enemy camp, Bob. It's almost poetic. I looked at the thin folder. It contained exactly what the public registry showed: a 1998 Ford truck, a modest bank account, and a small house on the edge of town. RBC Holdings was buried behind so many layers of legal shielding that even the IRS needed a map to find it. Serena thought she was swatting a fly. "What did you tell her?" I asked, my voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I played the sympathetic professional," Jerry replied. "I told her I would need to review the situation and that I would email her a retainer agreement and a strategy outline by Monday morning. Then I hung up and waited for you to call." I stood up, leaving the bourbon unfinished. The sorrow I had felt earlier in the day had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating mechanics. "Send her the retainer agreement," I instructed. "Bill her for every single minute of your time. Tell her exactly what she wants to hear and feed her whatever legal delays you have to. Do not let her suspect a thing. I need a wide window of time." Jerry nodded slowly, pulling a legal pad toward him. "And what are you going to do with that time?" "I need you to contact that forensic investigator we used during the commercial acquisition back in 2018, I said, buttoning my jacket. "I need someone who can dig through the dirt without leaving footprints." "Diana Cross," Jerry said, writing the name down with a heavy stroke of his pen. "She's the best. What's the target?" "I want everything," I said. "Bank records, past relationships, offshore accounts, hidden debts. If she has a parking ticket from 10 years ago, I want to read the citation." I turned and walked out of the office. The sun had finally dipped below the skyline, plunging the city streets into twilight. As I walked to my truck, I wasn't thinking about my son anymore. I was turning the name Diana Cross over and over in my mind. If Serena was willing to execute a hostile legal takeover of an old man just to preserve her social standing, it begged a very dangerous question. Who exactly was Serena Whitfield Calloway really, and what else was she hiding? The question I had carried out of Jerry's building the previous evening hung in my mind like thick smoke all the way to Monday morning. Who exactly was the woman attempting to erase me? Diana Cross did not operate out of a gleaming downtown high-rise. Her workspace was located in a modest brick building on the edge of the industrial district. Walking into her office was like stepping inside a perfectly calibrated machine. There wasn't a single stray piece of paper on her desk. There were no family photos, no decorative plants, and absolutely no room for ambiguity. As a former federal forensic accountant, Diana made her living hunting down the ghosts that people tried to bury in their ledgers. I sat across from her and laid out the basic mathematics of my daughter-in-law's existence. She is a mid-level manager at Whitfield and associates her mother's boutique insurance firm, I explained, my voice steady. Based on industry standards for that specific title in this county, she pulls in roughly $95,000 a year. My son does well, but he's still a junior executive. Diana didn't nod. She simply poised a silver pen over a blank legal pad. Yet, I continued, they recently closed on a $1.4 million property in the Gated Heights. There are 2 brand-new top-tier European SUVs parked in their driveway. They take biannual vacations to places like Milan and St. Bart's, and she wears clothes that cost more than my first mortgage. The numbers are fundamentally incompatible with reality. People leverage debt all the time to maintain appearances. Diana noted, her tone entirely devoid of emotion. Credit cards and heavy mortgages explain ambition, I replied. They don't explain the sheer arrogance required to initiate a hostile legal takeover of a family member. She is moving with the desperation of someone who needs absolute control. I need to know why. Diana wrote down 3 lines of text, capped her pen, and looked up at me with pale, assessing eyes. 2 weeks, she said. The subsequent 14 days required a specific kind of endurance. Waiting is a passive act for most men, but for a tradesman, patience is an active discipline. You cannot force a coat of varnish to dry faster by shouting at it. You simply do the next necessary task. I went to work. I drove to the Crestfield Senior Village every single morning before sunrise. On Wednesday, I completely dismantled and rebuilt the malfunctioning radiator unit in room 7, ensuring old Mr. Henderson wouldn't freeze during the upcoming winter drop. On Friday, I replaced a shattered brass doorknob in hallway C. I sat in the communal dining hall, ate my sandwiches, and listened to stories about grandchildren I would never meet. I kept my head down, and I let the hours pile up. Meanwhile, the silence I had engineered began to severely agitate the other side of the city. By the middle of the first week, Danny called twice. I didn't answer. By the second week, the frequency escalated rapidly. My phone screen would light up while I was measuring lumber, displaying his name. Then it would happen again during my lunch break. By the 10th day, the notification icon indicated 11 missed calls. He never left a voicemail. I knew exactly what was happening. Jerry Sutton was flawlessly executing my orders, burying Serena in an avalanche of bureaucratic delays and demanding endless psychological evaluations before proceeding with her trap. Serena was furious, and she was undoubtedly forcing Danny to track me down to see if I suspected anything. I left the phone face down on my workbench. Late on a Tuesday evening, nearing the end of Diana's requested deadline, I was sitting alone in my detached workshop. The main overhead lights were off. Only a single adjustable desk lamp cast a narrow pool of illumination over my scarred wooden table. I wasn't working on a gift. I had a block of scrap cherry wood in my left hand and a sharp carving blade in my right. I was slowly, methodically shaving away ribbons of timber, forming the rough shape of a miniature horse. I didn't care about the proportions. I simply needed the repetitive physical friction of the steel cutting through the grain. It kept my hands occupied, while my mind navigated the dark waters of my son's impending ruin. The dim workshop smelled heavily of cedar shavings and oil. To my right, sitting on a dusty canvas dropcloth, my cell phone remained stubbornly silent. The screen was dark, hiding the 11 unanswered attempts from a boy who had once thought I was invincible. I dragged the blade down the cherry wood, curling a perfect spiral shaving onto the floor. Suddenly, the harsh mechanical vibration of the phone shattered the quiet of the garage. The device buzzed violently against the table, slowly rotating itself from the kinetic energy. I stopped the blade. I didn't look at the screen immediately. I set the carving tool down on the rack, brushed the sawdust off my calloused palms, and reached for the device. The caller ID didn't say Danny. It was a local Crestfield number entirely unlisted. I picked it up and swiped the screen. Bob. Diana Cross's voice came through the speaker, crisp and echoing with a dangerous metallic edge. I have the file, and the mathematics are much worse than you thought. So, you are going to want to sit down for this, Bob. Diana Cross's voice transmitted through the small speaker of my cellular device, sharp and entirely stripped of pleasantries. I am already sitting, I replied. I was positioned at my kitchen table in the dead of night, a yellow legal pad resting on the chipped surface in front of me, a ballpoint pen gripped tightly in my right hand. Good, the former forensic investigator said, because the reality of your daughter-in-law's financial architecture is much darker than mere credit card debt or leveraged mortgages. Serena is operating a highly sophisticated systematic premium diversion scheme. I didn't interrupt. I let the pen hover over the blank yellow paper, waiting for the mechanics of the betrayal to be fully exposed. Whitfield and Associates operates as a boutique brokerage, meaning they collect payments from clients and then route those funds to the massive national underwriting corporations. Diana explained, her tone methodical, treating the crime scene like a mathematical equation. Serena identified a critical vulnerability in their legacy accounting software. For the past 28 months, whenever a specific demographic of clients submitted their monthly premium checks, she intercepted the manual data entry process. She diverted the incoming capital into a shadow ledger, a secondary clearing account strictly under her administrative control, instead of forwarding the money to the national underwriters. How much? The two words tasted like ash in my mouth. $890,000, Diana stated. There was no hesitation in her delivery, accumulated over exactly 2 years and 4 months. She utilized the stolen capital to fund the $1.4 million property down payment, the European vacations, the luxury vehicles, and the designer wardrobe you noticed. She literally built her entire high society facade using stolen bricks. I pressed the tip of the pen into the paper until I felt the pad give way. Who are the targets? Who is she taking it from? That is the worst part of the audit, Diana said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. She didn't target wealthy corporate accounts or aggressive hedge fund managers who would notice a discrepancy immediately. She specifically isolated 71 individual clients. The average age of these victims is 76 years old. Most of them are widows or widowers living on tight fixed incomes. A cold, heavy dread began to pool at the base of my stomach. Because the underwriting corporations never received the monthly payments, Diana continued delivering the final fatal blow. The insurance providers quietly canceled the coverage for non-payment. The victims have absolutely no idea. They believe they are fully protected. But as of right now, those 71 elderly individuals are holding completely voided contracts. If any of them require emergency surgery tomorrow or need to be moved into an assisted memory care facility next week, they will discover that they do not possess a single dime of coverage. Serena hasn't just stolen their money, Bob. She has secretly dismantled their safety nets. How and her mother? I asked, my voice reduced to a low, dangerous gravel. Does Maggie know her firm is harboring a thief? Willful blindness, Diana answered immediately. I pulled the internal digital footprints. Maggie accessed the flagged clearing account twice last November. She saw the irregularities. She is a veteran broker. She knew exactly what she was looking at. But instead of triggering a federal audit and risking the immaculate generational reputation of her family's firm, she simply closed the window and looked the other way. She is not the architect of the theft, but she is absolutely complicit through her silence. Send me the files, I instructed. They are already in your encrypted inbox, Diana said. What is your next move? I don't know yet, I lied. I ended the call and set the device down on the table. I sat utterly motionless in the dimly lit kitchen. Outside the window, a sudden, fierce gust of autumn wind tore through the massive branches of the old oak trees lining the street. The rushing, violent sound possessed a deep, rumbling bass, mimicking the heavy roar of a midnight freight train tearing through the darkness, despite the fact that there were no railway tracks within 30 miles of Crestfield City. I opened my weathered laptop. For the next 3 consecutive nights, my routine shifted into a grueling test of endurance. I continued my maintenance shifts at the senior center from dawn until the early afternoon, fixing pipes and repairing floorboards. But when the sun went down, I retreated to my kitchen, turned the screen brightness down to a harsh, blinding minimum, and opened the massive encrypted PDF files Diana had provided. I did not just skim the bottom-line totals. I forced myself to read every single page. I read the rows and columns until the harsh blue light burned my retinas. I read the names of the victims, In America, when you are surviving entirely on a meager pension and Social Security, every single dollar is a matter of physical survival. I looked at the stolen amounts and translated the numbers into brutal reality. $200 a month stolen from a retired factory worker meant that man was rationing his blood pressure medication, cutting his pills in half just to make the bottle last. $300 stolen from a widow meant she was turning her thermostat down to 55 degrees in the dead of January, wrapping herself in blankets to avoid a heating bill she could no longer afford. Serena was parading around high-end charity galas, sipping expensive champagne, while actively bleeding the most vulnerable members of society dry. On the third night, near the very end of the massive spreadsheet, I stopped scrolling. My eyes locked onto a single entry on page 42. Eleanor Briggs, age 83, address Pinewood District. The Pinewood District was a working-class neighborhood situated just a few miles from my own home. It was an area filled with small, aluminum-sided houses and people who worked with their hands their entire lives. Policy type comprehensive long-term care. Monthly premium $390. I tracked my finger across the digital row. Eleanor Briggs had faithfully mailed a physical check for $390 on the first of every single month for 4 consecutive years. Serena had intercepted every single one of them. The total amount stolen from this one woman was $18,720. I stared at the name Eleanor Briggs until the black text began to swim and blur in my vision. My mind aggressively pulled me away from the glowing screen and dropped me right back into the brightly lit dining hall of the Crestfield Senior Village. I saw the faces of the people I spent my days protecting. I saw the gentle, wrinkled smiles of women who baked me pies and showed me photographs of their newborn grandchildren. I heard the fragile voices of the men who asked me to tighten the hinges on their doors because their arthritic hands could no longer grip a screwdriver. Serena wasn't just stealing from abstract, faceless entities in a corporate database. She was systematically cannibalizing the exact demographic of people I belonged to. She was draining the lifeblood of my people. The betrayal was no longer just about a disrespectful daughter-in-law trying to push an old carpenter out of a family portrait. It had escalated into a fundamental war of class morality and survival. It was 2:15 in the morning. I finally closed the laptop. The sudden plunge into total darkness inside the kitchen felt heavy and suffocating. I remained seated in the hard wooden chair, my breathing slow and measured. I turned my head, looking toward the dark hallway leading to the living room. Hidden in the shadows of that corridor was the framed photograph of the woman I had buried decades ago. I sat there in the silence, vividly remembering the crushing, terrifying weight of the medical debt that had defined the darkest, most agonizing years of my existence. I remembered watching my wife wither away while collection agencies called our landline 4 times a day. My love. I whispered into the empty, silent house, my voice trembling not with sorrow, but with a terrifying, absolute, and righteous clarity. The woman sleeping in the same bed as our son is stealing the very last shred of dignity from people just like you. The period of calculated observation was officially over. Tomorrow morning, when the sun finally decided to rise over Crestfield City, I had 2 absolutely critical destinations on my itinerary. The first was to establish a secure, untraceable communication channel with the State Insurance Fraud Investigative Division. The second was a modest aluminum-sided house over in the Pinewood District. I needed to look a woman named Eleanor Briggs directly in the eyes. The early hours of the morning have always belonged to the working class. Long before the stock markets open or the corporate emails begin to circulate, the world is maintained by people who drink bitter coffee in the dark and drive pickup trucks through empty intersections. I navigated the quiet streets of Crestfield as the horizon just barely began to fracture with a pale, bruised purple. The heavy, low-hanging mist swallowed the headlights of my vehicle, wrapping the sleeping city in a damp, spectral hush. My destination was not the senior village, I drove out toward the affluent western ridge, pulling up to the imposing wrought iron gates of the Harrogate Club at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. There were no valets standing at the portico. The affluent members were still hours away from their tea times and mimosa brunches. The grounds were completely deserted, save for a solitary landscaping truck, parked near the maintenance sheds in the far distance. I bypassed the grand main entrance and drove around to the service alley, cutting the engine in the shadow of a massive ancient weeping willow. I reached into the pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. Resting next to a handful of loose galvanized screws was a sleek, black electronic key fob. It was an object that felt entirely alien against the rough calluses of my palm. I pressed the small button. The heavy service door of the main building disengaged with a deep, authoritative click. I was not trespassing. I possessed the absolute legal right to unlock any door on this 45-acre estate. Stepping into the service corridor, the air immediately shifted. It smelled of industrial floor wax and chilled, stagnant air. I walked slowly, my heavy boots creating a steady, rhythmic echo against the polished marble, until I emerged into the grand ballroom. This was the exact room where 2 weeks prior I had been reduced to a silent, invisible prop. The crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling were dark now, their thousands of facets sleeping in the gloom. The rows of high-backed mahogany chairs were perfectly aligned around the perimeter, resembling a silent army waiting for a battle that would never arrive. I looked at the specific spot where the velvet gift table had stood. I felt a brief phantom echo of the humiliation, but I pushed it away. I hadn't come here to think about my son. I hadn't come here to think about the woman he married, or the devastating financial crimes she was currently executing against vulnerable people. I needed to cleanse my mind of their poison for just a little while. This specific piece of earth held a meaning that predated their arrogance by decades. I crossed the expansive ballroom and pushed open the heavy glass double doors that led out to the rear terrace. The transition from the sterile engineered climate of the building to the living, breathing reality of the outdoors was instantaneous. The sprawling, meticulously engineered rear rose gardens stretched out before me, a labyrinth of deep crimson pale blush and vibrant ivory petals. Millions of tiny dewdrops clung to the leaves, catching the very first fragile rays of the morning sun. The air was overwhelmingly thick with the damp, intoxicating perfume of wet soil and blooming flowers. I walked down the winding stone path, the gravel crunching softly beneath my worn soles. I walked past the marble fountains and the ornate iron benches, heading straight toward the very edge of the manicured property, stopping only when the perfect grass gave way to an old, crumbling boundary wall made of stacked fieldstone. I rested my rough hands on the cold, damp stone. I closed my eyes, and the 42 years separating the present from the past simply dissolved into the morning mist. It was the sweltering, unforgiving summer of 1982. Back then, there were no crystal chandeliers here. There were no valets, no imported marble, and no hybrid tea roses. This sprawling expanse of land was known as the Pearson Farm. It was a rugged, struggling agricultural plot where the grass grew tall and wild, and the thick summer air smelled heavily of livestock, sweet clover, and dust. I was 22 years old. I possessed nothing but a canvas tool roll, a bruised pair of knuckles, and an endless reservoir of raw, undirected energy. The Pearson family had hired me as a junior apprentice to rebuild a half-mile stretch of rotting perimeter fencing to keep their cattle from wandering onto the county highway. I was kneeling in the dry dirt on a particularly blistering Tuesday afternoon, wrestling with a stubborn, rusted post-hole digger. The sweat was stinging my eyes, and my shirt was plastered to my back. Then I heard the soft, rapid sound of footsteps navigating the uneven ground. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the glaring sun. Carol was 20 years old. She worked the morning shift at a small, greasy spoon diner 3 miles down the road. She was taking a shortcut through the farm, to beat a massive bruised thunderhead that was rapidly building in the western sky. She was wearing her faded uniform, a pale blue dress covered by a white apron that bore a small, stubborn coffee stain near the left pocket. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back, escaping in loose strands around her face. She was looking up at the approaching storm clouds, entirely distracted, and she failed to notice the jagged, heavy piece of timber I had carelessly left resting across the walking path. Her foot caught the edge of the wood. She let out a sudden, sharp gasp as her balance completely evaporated, pitching her forward toward the hard, sun-baked earth. I dropped the heavy iron tool and lunged. My calloused hands caught her shoulders mere inches before she hit the ground. The sudden momentum brought us dangerously close. For 3 terrifying, electric seconds, time simply stopped. I could feel her heart hammering rapidly against my palms. She smelled like cheap, sweet vanilla perfume and toasted bread. In that suspended moment, bathed in the golden, dusty light of 1982, I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that my life would never be the same. "I am so incredibly sorry." I stammered, my face burning with a sudden intense heat that had nothing to do with the summer weather. "I should have moved that beam." She didn't scold me. She didn't pull away in disgust. She carefully straightened her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and looked at me. And then she laughed. It was a bright, clear, ringing sound that seemed to silence the deafening roar of the cicadas in the surrounding trees. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Desperate to recover from my clumsiness, I reached over the wooden fence line into a dense, tangled thicket of wild, uncultivated briars. I snapped off a single, vibrant pink wild rose. The thorns bit sharply into my thumb, drawing a tiny bead of blood, but I ignored the sting. I offered the small, resilient flower to her. She took it gently, her fingers brushing against mine. She looked out over the rolling, uneven hills of the cattle farm, a playful, brilliant light dancing in her eyes. "You know, Bobby," she said, her voice carrying a teasing musical lilt. "One day, when we are incredibly rich and famous, you are going to buy me this entire garden. No more cows, no more fences, just roses as far as the eye can see." I wiped the dirt and sweat from my brow with the back of my forearm offering a wide, foolish grin. "One day, Carol." I promised, the words floating lightly into the humid air. One day. It was a throwaway joke, a casual, impossible vow made by a boy with $40 to his name and a lifetime of manual labor ahead of him. I opened my eyes, the memory fading as the cold reality of 2020 came rushing back. The Pearson farm was dead and buried beneath millions of dollars of landscaping. The wild briars had been eradicated to make room for exotic blooms, and the girl in the blue diner uniform had been gone for 22 agonizing years. When the global pandemic shattered the economy, the Harrogate Club faced imminent catastrophic bankruptcy. The board of directors was desperate. From the quiet shadows of my kitchen, I instructed my legal counsel to execute an aggressive, all-cash acquisition through my corporate entity. $4.1 million. I didn't authorize the wire transfer for the prestige of owning an elite establishment. I didn't care about the profit margins or the exclusivity. I bought 45 acres of prime real estate because of a single reckless promise made over a rusted post-hole digger. I stood there in the chilling morning air, staring at the manicured beauty of the estate. I reached out and touched the velvet petal of a dark red bloom. "I kept the promise, my love," I whispered, the sound of my own voice cracking, fracturing the perfect silence of the garden. A heavy burning ache settled deep in my throat. "I bought the garden, even if it is late, even if you aren't here to see it." The profound grief was absolute, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a quiet, solid foundation, standing in the place where my entire life truly began. The weight of the upcoming war felt different. I wasn't just fighting to protect my assets from a greedy daughter-in-law. I was fighting to protect the integrity of the life Carol and I had built from absolutely nothing. I remained by the stone wall for several more minutes, letting the rising sun warm the chill from my shoulders. Finally, I turned away from the roses and walked back through the grand ballroom, my steps steady and resolute. I climbed back into the cab of my truck and locked the doors. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my phone and navigated to a highly restricted contact number. Tom Briley was the senior operational manager of the Harrogate Club. He was a man of absolute discretion, the only individual on the payroll who knew the true identity of the owner. I pressed the call button. The line rang twice before he answered. "Tom," I said, my voice completely stripped of the emotion from the garden replaced by cold steel. "It is Bob Calloway." "Bob?" Tom replied, his tone laced with immediate surprise. "I certainly wasn't expecting to hear from you at this hour. Is there an issue with the facility?" "I want to have a very serious conversation regarding the operational future of the Harrogate Club," I stated evenly. There was a heavy loaded pause on the other end of the line. Tom was a smart man. He could hear the gravity in my tone. "Bob." Tom hesitated, choosing his words with extreme care. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" I looked out the windshield at the imposing architecture of the building. "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life," I replied. The afternoon sun was casting long, exhausted shadows across the cracked concrete sidewalks of the Pinewood district. When I finally parked my truck, this was a neighborhood built entirely on the concept of endurance. The streets were lined with narrow, brick-faced buildings constructed decades ago for factory workers and tradesmen. It was a place where people measured their wealth, not in portfolios, but in the lack of outstanding debts. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at a weathered 3-story apartment building. The address perfectly matched the single devastating line of data I had memorized from the forensic report. I pushed the heavy front door open and stepped into a narrow, dimly lit foyer that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and old floor wax. There was no elevator. I grabbed the wooden handrail, feeling it rattle and shift loosely under my grip, and began the slow climb up the groaning wooden stairs to the second floor. I stopped in front of apartment 2B. I took a slow, deep breath, attempting to smooth the hardened edges of my posture, and knocked 3 times. A moment later, the brass deadbolt clicked. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman who looked exactly like the grandmother every child in this country deserves. Eleanor Briggs was 83 years old. Her striking white hair was swept up into a neat, unpretentious bun. She wore a faded floral print housecoat that had clearly been washed 100 times, and she held a delicate porcelain teacup and saucer in her left hand, steady and calm. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was thin, carrying the fragile timbre of advanced age, but her pale blue eyes were sharp and incredibly kind. "Mrs. Briggs," I said, removing my canvas cap. "My name is Bob Calloway. I apologize for arriving unannounced. I am not with the government, and I am absolutely not here to sell you anything. I am conducting an independent review regarding a specific long-term care insurance policy you hold, and I was hoping I could ask you a few brief questions." She studied my face for a moment, her eyes tracing the deep lines around my mouth and the grease stains permanently etched into the fabric of my jacket. Something in my demeanor must have passed her silent inspection. "Well, Mr. Calloway, standing in a drafty hallway is no way to conduct a review," she said, stepping aside and gesturing inward. "Please come in. The kettle is still warm." I stepped across the threshold and entered a sanctuary. The small apartment was impeccably clean and overwhelmingly warm. Every available surface was covered in framed photographs, graduations, weddings, babies, and knitted blankets. A collection of thriving, vibrant potted ferns and spider plants crowded the tiny windowsill, soaking up the afternoon light. It was a room entirely saturated with love. I sat down on a worn velvet armchair. She retreated to the kitchen and returned a minute later, placing a steaming cup of chamomile tea on the crocheted doily resting on the coffee table in front of me. She took a seat on the sofa opposite mine. "The long-term care policy," Eleanor began, setting her own cup down. "It's a funny thing to ask about. I've never actually used it. My daughter Sarah, she was the one who insisted I sign the paperwork 4 years ago. She worries, you see. She has 2 teenagers of her own and a husband who works the night shift at the distribution center. They barely have enough to keep their own heads above water." I listened, keeping my hands resting quietly on my knees. Sarah read these awful stories about what happens when older folks fall and break a hip or need to be moved into a nursing facility. Eleanor continued adjusting the cuffs of her housecoat. "The medical bills can swallow an entire estate in a matter of months. She was terrified that if something happened to me, the state would force us to sell this little apartment to pay for the care. She didn't want to lose the only inheritance I have left to give her." "So you purchased the comprehensive coverage?" I prompted gently. "I did," she nodded. $390 due on the 1st of every single month. I did the math in my head again. I already knew the total $18,720. But hearing the monthly figure spoken aloud in this tiny room gave it a crushing weight. "If you don't mind my asking, Mrs. Briggs," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what is your monthly income?" She smiled, a brief, self-deprecating expression. "My late husband's pension and my Social Security combined bring in just under $2,000 a month. That premium takes a rather large bite out of the grocery budget, I admit. I haven't bought fresh beef in a very long time, and I keep the thermostat at 60 degrees during the winter. But it's worth the peace of mind, knowing that my Sarah won't be ruined if my health fails. That lets me sleep at night." I looked down at the chamomile tea. A profound, suffocating anger wrapped its fingers around my throat. This beautiful, selfless woman was shivering through the January cold, sacrificing her own basic comforts to send $390 a month directly into my daughter-in-law's shadow ledger. Serena was buying imported leather handbags with the money Eleanor Briggs was saving by not turning on her radiator. And worse, Eleanor was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that her safety net had been secretly shredded. If she fell tomorrow, she would lose this apartment. "Have you ever missed a payment?" I asked. "Never," Eleanor said proudly. "I walk down to the post office on the 28th of every month and mail the physical check. I just want to have it ready, heaven forbid I ever need it." I looked around the room, taking in the photographs, the thriving plants, and the quiet dignity of a life lived with honor. I could not tell her. I could not shatter her peace of mind right here, right now, by explaining that she was the victim of a ruthless corporate theft. I stood up slowly, picking up my canvas cap. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Briggs," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to trust me. I cannot explain the details to you this afternoon, but I give you my absolute word. By this time next week, things are going to be very different regarding your policy." Eleanor didn't ask me to clarify. She didn't press for details. She simply looked down at my hands, at the thick, scarred knuckles, the split fingernails, and the permanent calluses built by decades of swinging a hammer and gripping a saw. She looked back up at my face, a gentle understanding light in her eyes. "You're a carpenter, aren't you, Mr. Calloway?" she asked softly. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "I am," Eleanor offered a warm, genuine smile. My father framed houses for 40 years. I know what that kind of labor does to a man. A carpenter's hands are trustworthy. I swallowed the heavy knot forming in my throat, nodded respectfully, and walked out the door. I descended the groaning wooden staircase, my boots hitting the steps with a heavy, rhythmic finality. I didn't make it all the way to the street. I stopped halfway down the second flight, standing in the dim, cabbage-scented foyer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cellular phone. I bypassed Jerry Sutton. I bypassed the private investigator. I dialed a number I had pulled from a state directory earlier that morning. The line rang 3 times before a professional clipped voice answered. State Department of Insurance Investigative Division. Agent Webb speaking. I leaned against the peeling plaster wall of the stairwell, my jaw set like stone. Agent Webb, I said, the absolute certainty in my voice leaving no room for negotiation. My name is Bob Calloway. I have documented irrefutable evidence of a massive, multi-tiered premium diversion fraud occurring within a licensed brokerage firm in your jurisdiction. I need to see you immediately. The harsh, artificial hum of overhead fluorescent tubes is the universal soundtrack of government bureaucracy. It was shortly after 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, and the investigative division of the State Department of Insurance possessed an atmosphere completely devoid of warmth. There were no thriving potted ferns here. There was only the smell of burnt coffee, industrial carpet cleaner, and the quiet, relentless grinding of legal machinery. I sat in a hard plastic chair across from Agent Marcus Webb. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a slightly wrinkled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His desk was incredibly organized, holding nothing but a computer monitor, a desk phone, and the thick, heavy binder containing the forensic audit Diana Cross had compiled. Webb had been reading in absolute silence for nearly 20 minutes. I did not interrupt him. I simply waited, keeping the promise I had made to a woman drinking chamomile tea less than 24 hours earlier securely at the forefront of my mind. Finally, Webb closed the heavy cover of the binder. He took off his wire-rimmed reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked directly at me. His expression was not shocked. Investigators who have spent 3 decades hunting financial predators rarely experience shock. He merely looked grim. Mr. Calloway? Webb began, his voice possessing a dry, gravelly texture. The documentation provided here is terrifyingly precise. If these digital footprints hold up to our internal verification processes, we are not looking at a mere regulatory infraction. This is systemic multi-count wire fraud, aggravated by elder abuse statutes. The individual who engineered this bypass is looking at a significant federal prison sentence. I am fully aware of the consequences. I replied, my tone perfectly level. Webb leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. You also realize that when I run the names listed in the corporate hierarchy of Whitfield and Associates, I am going to find a direct connection to you. The primary architect of this embezzlement is your daughter-in-law. She is the woman who married my son. I corrected him quietly. She is not my family. Webb studied me for a long, calculating moment. He recognized that I was not a grieving father seeking leniency, nor a disgruntled relative looking for a quick payout. I was the man delivering the executioner's axe. Given the flight risk associated with the capital involved, standard protocol dictates that I dispatch a tactical white-collar unit to her corporate office this afternoon to secure the hard drives and make the arrest, Webb stated. But you didn't bring this directly to my desk at 9 in the morning without having a specific request. How do you want this to happen? I need 5 days, I said. I want the arrest to take place this coming Saturday in the late afternoon, and I want it to happen at a specific location. The Harrogate Club. Webb frowned deeply, shaking his head. Mr. Calloway, the Department of Insurance does not operate a theatrical production company. We do not stage public spectacles for personal vendettas. It is not about spectacle, Agent Webb. It is about an absolute necessary destruction of an illusion. I explained, leaning closer. My son has spent the last 5 years of his life completely submerged in a fabricated reality. If your officers arrest his wife at a mahogany desk on a random Tuesday, she will spin a narrative. She will claim it is a misunderstanding, a corporate error, or a setup. And he will spend the rest of his life bankrupting himself in legal fees, believing she is a martyr. He needs to watch her foundation collapse in the exact environment she built with the stolen funds. He needs to see the truth with his own 2 eyes, surrounded by the society she committed these crimes to impress. Webb remained silent, weighing the operational logistics against the psychological necessity of my request. He looked at the thick binder, perhaps thinking about the 71 elderly citizens whose lives had been quietly jeopardized. Saturday afternoon. Webb finally agreed, his voice a low rumble. You have exactly 5 days, not 1 hour more. One more thing, I said, turning back before reaching the door. There is a woman named Eleanor Briggs living at the Pinewood District address in the file. I want her present on Saturday, not as a witness in any official capacity, simply as a private citizen choosing to attend. I will arrange her transportation personally and take full responsibility for her presence. Webb looked at me for a long moment, then gave a single nod. I stood up, offered him a firm handshake, and walked out of the sterile building. The Crestfield city air felt incredibly sharp as I climbed into the cab of my truck. I didn't start the engine immediately. I picked up my phone and dialed the operational manager of the estate I had visited just yesterday at dawn. Tom, I said when the line connected, we need to initiate a massive structural pivot regarding the property. A pivot? Tom Briley echoed, sounding cautious. What kind of pivot are we discussing, Bob? A renovation of the East Wing. I want to cease accepting all new membership applications effective immediately. I instructed, staring straight through the windshield. I want you to contact our architectural firm by noon. Have them begin drafting preliminary blueprints to completely demolish the grand ballroom, the dining halls, and the recreational facilities. We are going to clear the entire footprint, save for the rear gardens. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Bob, you cannot be serious, Tom said, his professional composure briefly fracturing. Do you have any idea what you are suggesting? That specific facility generates over $850,000 in annual membership dues alone. It is a historical landmark of wealth. What on earth are you planning to put in its place? We are going to build a state-of-the-art, heavily subsidized residential community for elderly citizens operating on fixed incomes, I said. Independent living with full medical support staff on site. The rent will be calculated strictly as a minor percentage of their monthly pensions. And I want the legal documents drawn up today to officially rename the entire 45-acre parcel. Rename it to what? Tom asked, entirely bewildered. Briggs Commons, I stated. Briggs. Chita, Tom repeated, searching his memory for a wealthy political donor or a famous historical figure. Who is Briggs? An 83-year-old woman who currently lives on a second floor with no elevator, I replied. I ended the call before Tom could formulate another question. When I arrived home that evening, I walked directly into the kitchen. Hanging on the wall next to the refrigerator was a cheap paper calendar provided by a local hardware store. I took a thick red marker from the drawer, uncapped it, and drew a heavy, undeniable circle around the upcoming Saturday. 5 days. The ensuing week required an almost superhuman level of compartmentalization. I did not alter my routine by a single degree. I woke up in the dark, put on my uniform, and drove to the senior center. I replaced stripped screws on heavy oak doors. I changed flickering light bulbs in the communal recreation rooms. I sat and ate my lunch in the basement workshop, listening to the quiet hum of the building. And every single afternoon, my phone would vibrate against the wooden workbench. Danny was no longer calling once or twice. The notifications were relentless. Jerry Sutton was flawlessly executing his role as the double agent, burying Serena's legal maneuverings in a nightmare of endless paperwork, demanding competency hearings, and stalling the conservatorship process indefinitely. The silence from my end, combined with the legal brick wall, was clearly causing a massive panic in their household. When I occasionally listened to the voicemails my son left, I noticed a distinct, profound shift. The arrogant, irritated tone of a busy executive swatting away an annoyance was entirely gone. His voice was growing increasingly frantic, tight, and edged with a creeping, undeniable desperation. He was a man standing on a frozen lake, finally beginning to hear the ice cracking beneath his expensive leather shoes. I deleted every single message without replying. I just kept my eyes fixed on the red circle on the calendar, waiting for Saturday to arrive. The 5 days leading up to the weekend were entirely defined by the mechanical rhythm of physical labor and the slow, inevitable unspooling of my son's engineered reality. I did not alter my schedule. I clocked into the maintenance department every morning before dawn. I navigated the familiar corridors, repairing broken fixtures and listening to the quiet murmur of the elderly residents. It was an anchor of normalcy against the impending storm. And every single day, the cellular device resting in my pocket cataloged Danny's descent into absolute panic. The first message arrived on Sunday evening, while I was sitting at my kitchen table polishing my carving chisels. "Dad." Danny's recorded voice played through the small speaker. The tone was surprisingly gentle, stripped of the corporate arrogance he usually wore. "I know yesterday was bad. I am really sorry about how things went down at the club. Can we talk? Please give me a call back." I wiped the steel blade with an oiled cloth and deleted the audio file. By Monday afternoon, the frequency increased, and the underlying texture of his voice had fundamentally shifted. I was in the basement of the residential complex, threading a new copper pipe, when I listened to the third message. "Dad, it's me again," he said, speaking quickly, his breath shallow. "Listen, something weird is happening here at the house. Serena is making these hushed phone calls from the guest room, and she hangs up the second I walk through the door. Are you okay? Is everything all right with you?" He was noticing the cracks. Jerry Sutton was aggressively stonewalling Serena's legal maneuvers, demanding medical verifications, and pushing back on her timeline. She was undoubtedly scrambling, and her sudden intense secrecy was bleeding into her marriage. The 6th voicemail landed on Tuesday during my lunch break. I sat in the cab of my truck, the engine turned off, listening to the audio. "Dad," Danny began, and for the first time in years, I heard a distinct tremor in his vocal cords. "A neighbor stopped me in the driveway this morning. They asked how you were doing. They said Serena mentioned to them that you were having severe memory issues, that you were getting confused. Dad, that is not true, right? Tell me that is not true." I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the headrest. She was laying the social groundwork, preparing their affluent circle of friends for the sudden legal seizure of my independence. The definitive breaking point occurred on Wednesday. The 9th message arrived just after 5 o'clock. "Dad, pick up the phone. Please pick up." The panic was raw and unfiltered now. Serena left her laptop open on the kitchen island. She got an email from a downtown attorney. I peeked at it. It had your name on it, Dad, and it used the word conservatorship. What is she doing? What is happening right now? I didn't respond. I couldn't. If I engaged, if I offered him a lifeline, Serena would simply weave a new lie and pull him back under the water. He had to drown in the confusion until the absolute truth could be revealed. The silence stretched through Thursday and into Friday. I went through the motions of my shift, my muscles aching with a tension that had nothing to do with lifting heavy lumber. At 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the 11th and final voicemail vibrated against my leg. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my vehicle in the employee parking lot, preparing to head home for the weekend. I pulled the device out and pressed play. "Dad," Danny whispered. His voice was completely wrecked, hoarse, and jagged, sounding exactly like he was fighting back tears. "I need to see you. I don't know who she is anymore. I don't know what to do. I'm scared." The recording ended, leaving a hollow, agonizing hiss of static. I set the device down on the center console. I stared straight ahead through the dusty windshield, looking at the brick facade of the building without actually seeing it. My chest felt incredibly tight, as if an iron band were slowly compressing my ribs. There was a sudden sharp tapping on the driver's side window. I flinched, turning my head. Mrs. Patterson was standing outside on the asphalt, leaning heavily on her aluminum walker. I rolled the window down. "Bob, honey, are you okay?" she asked, her wrinkled face etched with genuine concern. "Are you crying?" I reached a rough hand up to my face. My fingertips came away wet. I hadn't even realized the tears had fallen. The stoic fortress I had built around myself over the last 2 weeks had finally cracked, broken by the terrified voice of a boy who just wanted his father. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my canvas jacket, forcing a tight, reassuring smile. "I am okay, Mrs. Patterson," I said softly, my voice thick. "Just missing my wife today. That's all." She offered a sympathetic nod, touching my arm gently before turning to walk away. I drove home in silence. The hours crawled by in the quiet house. I waited until the darkness was absolute. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, I picked up the phone. I didn't call him. I opened the messaging application and typed a single definitive sentence. "Son, I need you at the Harrogate Club tomorrow at 1 p.m. Alone. Do not tell Serena." I hit send. I watched the screen glow in the dark kitchen. Exactly 3 minutes later, the small text beneath the message shifted to read "delivered" and then read. There was no reply. The trap was set and the countdown had officially reached 0. The Saturday sky stretching over Crestfield City was a cold, unforgiving expanse of unbroken blue. I drove my battered Ford through the imposing wrought iron gates of the Harrogate Club at exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, a full 2 hours before the trap was scheduled to spring shut. A landscaping crew was scattered across the front lawns, their backs bent under the midday sun as they meticulously trimmed the decorative hedges. They briefly glanced at my rusted vehicle passing by, their expressions a mix of confusion and indifference, completely oblivious to the fact that the man behind the steering wheel personally authorized their monthly payroll. I parked near the service entrance and made my way toward the rear terrace. I walked past the sprawling rose garden I had visited just days prior. This time I did not stop. I did not linger by the boundary wall to summon the ghost of my late wife. I simply cast a brief, acknowledging glance at the crimson petals swaying in the breeze. My heart no longer had the capacity for nostalgic sorrow this afternoon. It had been coated in a thick layer of cold iron, fully prepared to surgically remove the toxic presence destroying my son's life. Stepping through the heavy double doors and into the grand ballroom, the suffocating atmosphere of extreme, curated wealth hit me like a physical blow. The massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the vaulted ceilings, catching the sunlight and casting fractured light across the pristine marble floors. The walls, paneled in rare mahogany, exuded the distinct heavy scent of expensive lemon oil polish and generational arrogance. I stopped dead center in the middle of the vast, empty room. This was the exact spot where, a mere 2 weeks ago, I had been reduced to a silent, invisible prop. "All of this is mine," I whispered into the cavernous silence. Every single chandelier, every hand-woven rug, every stem of the white lilies currently resting on the mantelpiece. At 11:30, Tom Briley entered through the side corridor. He wore a sharply tailored gray suit and carried a thick, leather-bound architectural tube under his right arm. Tom did not offer me the condescending nod reserved for the maintenance staff. He approached with the measured respect owed to the absolute sovereign of the estate. We moved to the largest, most ornate circular table in the room. Tom unsealed the tube and rolled the massive blueprints for Briggs Commons out across the polished wood, anchoring the corners with heavy crystal tumblers. The cayenne and white schematics instantly overlaid and erased the opulent aesthetic of the country club. It was a completely different vision of the world. The architectural drawings detailed 120 affordable residential units, tailored specifically for the elderly. The plans eliminated hazardous staircases, replacing them with graded ramps and reinforced hallway supports. The center of the complex featured a sprawling community vegetable garden, a state-of-the-art diagnostic medical clinic, and a vast communal dining hall designed to maximize natural sunlight. Tom traced a finger over the final estimated budget printed on the bottom right corner. "Bob." Tom set his tone carrying a heavy dose of professional caution. "I am compelled to ask you one final time. This specific property generates over $850,000 annually from membership dues alone. It is a fortress of predictable, massive revenue. Are you absolutely certain you want to completely bulldoze this financial engine to construct a non-profit subsidized housing block?" I stared down at the blueprints, seeing the face of an 83-year-old woman offering me chamomile tea in a drafty apartment. I saw the residents of the Crestfield Senior Village. "Tom, do you have any idea how many individuals this country club actually serves?" I asked, my voice carrying the unyielding weight of a steel anvil. 200 families. 200 families come here solely to isolate themselves and feel superior to the rest of the working world. Briggs Commons will serve 120 families, but they are the individuals who truly desperately need a safe foundation to live out their final years with dignity. The ultimate value of a piece of land is not measured by the capital it generates, but by the lives it manages to salvage. Tom remained silent, slowly rolling the edge of the paper as the distant sound of an engine echoed from the front driveway. At exactly 1:45, Danny walked through the main archway. He was completely alone. The confident, sharply dressed financial executive was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man. He wore a wrinkled, untucked cotton shirt. His skin was an unhealthy ashen gray, and deep bruised circles hung heavily beneath his bloodshot eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept a single hour in the past 5 days. He surveyed the empty ballroom, his exhausted gaze jumping from the crystal fixtures to Tom Briley, to the blueprints spread across the table, and finally locking onto me. "Dad," Danny croaked, his voice cracking, sounding incredibly fragile. "What is going on here? Why are you at the club? And what are those drawings?" I stood up from the table, preparing to bridge the gap between us and end his torment. But before I could speak a single syllable, the sharp, aggressive, and rapid clacking of high heels striking the marble floor echoed violently from the main entryway. Serena marched into the ballroom, closely trailed by Maggie Whitfield. Both women were dressed impeccably, ready for a high society luncheon, but Serena's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and rage. Her eyes darted across the room, locking onto Danny standing near the table. Before I reveal the ultimate truth that is about to completely shatter Serena's entire world, I want to make sure you are still with me. If you are ready for this final confrontation, drop the number 100 or type "I'm ready" in the comments below right now, so I know you're still watching. Also, a quick heads up, the upcoming climax of our story contains some fictional elements carefully woven in for educational and narrative purposes. It may not be entirely based on actual events, so if you prefer not to hear this part, you are completely free to click away and exit the video right here. But if you want to see exactly how justice is served, let's get back into the ballroom. The rhythmic, aggressive staccato of expensive high heels striking the polished marble floor echoed through the cavernous ballroom, shattering the fragile tension that had settled between my son and me. I did not shift my posture. I remained standing beside the massive mahogany table, my hands resting loosely at my sides, watching the two women march toward the center of the room. Serena moved with the entitled velocity of a woman who firmly believed the universe was constructed to bend to her will. Maggie Whitfield trailed half a step behind her daughter, clutching a structured leather handbag, her posture rigid with an aristocratic indignation. Danny had made the mistake of calling a car service to the club, rather than driving himself a detail. Serena had discovered within minutes, by checking the shared household app they used to track ride bookings. She and Maggie had followed immediately, assuming he had suffered some kind of breakdown, and fled to the one place most associated with their family's social standing. When Serena's gaze finally snapped onto me, her forward momentum halted instantly. The irritation contorting her pristine features hardened into a mask of pure, undisguised contempt. What in the world is going on here? Serena demanded, her voice vibrating with a shrill, piercing frequency that bounced off the crystal fixtures above us. She looked at Danny, then back at me, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. I was not aware you were invited to the club today. Actually, I am quite certain the security at the front gate has strict protocols about unauthorized personnel wandering the grounds. I looked at her. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single fraction of the rage that had been boiling in my blood for 2 weeks. I wasn't invited. I stated, my tone as flat and unforgiving as a concrete slab. I am the host. Serena let out a short, breathy laugh. It was a polite, condescending sound, the kind of noise one makes when a child says something fundamentally absurd. She tilted her head, a patronizing smile stretching across her face. "Excuse me," she asked, dripping with venomous politeness. "Did you take a part-time landscaping shift, Bob?" I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch for 2 full seconds before delivering the final fatal strike to the foundation of her reality. "I am the host because I own this property," I said, articulating every single syllable with surgical precision. The Harrogate Club, all 45 acres of it, the ballroom we are standing in, the manicured greens outside the service quarters. I acquired the entire estate in the fall of 2020 through a corporate purchasing entity named RBC Holdings, LLC. The acronym stands for Robert B. Calloway. What followed was the longest, most profound 5 seconds of silence I had ever witnessed in my entire life. It was a physical, suffocating quiet. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken, pressing down on the 4 of us. I watched the cognitive dissonance violently tear through Serena's mind. The fundamental laws of physics governing her elite, carefully curated universe were suddenly collapsing. The man she had publicly humiliated, the man whose handcrafted gift she had treated like contaminated waste, was standing in a faded jacket, casually dismantling her entire social hierarchy. The polite, patronizing smile slowly melted off her face, replaced by a slack-jawed, hollow expression of total system failure. Maggie Whitfield was the first to break the vacuum. Her knuckles turned bone white as she gripped the handle of her designer purse. She took a step forward, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and furious denial. That is simply impossible." Maggie stammered, shaking her head aggressively. "The board of directors sold this facility to an anonymous private equity consortium. You are a maintenance worker. You fix leaky pipes at a retirement home. You do not possess the capital to even walk through the front door as a guest, let alone hold the master deed." I didn't argue with her. I simply gestured toward the gray-suited man standing silently near the grand archway. "Tom Briley is the senior operational manager of this facility. He facilitates the payroll. I can have him retrieve the master deed and the unredacted purchasing agreements from the primary safe right now, if you require physical verification." Maggie looked at Tom. Tom offered a grim, confirming nod. Maggie physically recoiled, taking a stumbling step backward, as if the floor beneath her shoes had suddenly turned to hot coals. Danny, who had been standing paralyzed near the edge of the table, finally moved. He took 2 slow, staggering steps toward me. The gray, ashen pallor of his skin seemed to deepen. He looked like a man who had just survived a horrific vehicle collision and was only now realizing the extent of his injuries. "Dad," Danny whispered, his voice incredibly fragile, desperate for an anchor in a world that was spinning violently out of control. "Are you telling the truth? Is this real?" I shifted my focus entirely to my son. I let the armor drop for just a fraction of a second, allowing the deep, enduring love of a father to bleed into my expression. "I have never lied to you, Danny," I said softly, the gravity of the words anchoring him to the floor. "Not once in 34 years. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide, pleading for an explanation. "When your mother passed away," I continued, speaking directly to him, ignoring the 2 women standing mere feet away, "I made a silent vow that you would never have to experience the kind of financial terror that destroyed our family. Every single hour of overtime I worked, every dollar I saved. By not buying a new vehicle or taking a vacation, I redirected into distressed property acquisitions. I bought my first ruined duplex in the spring of 2000. Then I bought another, and another." I paused, letting the scale of the decades-long sacrifice settle over the room. Over the course of 26 years, while clocking in at dawn to repair cabinets and plunge drains, I built a highly diversified real estate portfolio. I stated, the facts ringing out like strikes from a heavy hammer. As of this morning, RBC Holdings possesses 41 commercial and residential properties across the state. The total audited valuation of the portfolio sits at $34 million. You grew up thinking I was a failure because my hands were dirty, but the dirt on my hands built an empire you couldn't even begin to comprehend. Danny closed his eyes, a ragged, shuddering breath escaping his lungs. The staggering weight of his own profound misjudgment was crushing him in real time. He had traded his loyal, fiercely protective father for the hollow, glittering approval of a family that possessed a fraction of the actual wealth and absolutely none of the moral fortitude. Serena, however, was not broken by guilt. As the reality of the $34 million figure registered in her brain, her survival instincts overrode her shock. The sheer magnitude of the wealth shifted her paradigm. She was a predator, and she had just realized she was standing inside the vault she had been trying to rob all along. She forcibly straightened her spine, attempting to reclaim the high ground, projecting a fierce, defensive indignation. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Serena spat, her voice trembling but loud, attempting to steer the narrative. "Did you lure us all down here just to execute some theatrical revenge fantasy? Are you trying to humiliate your son in front of my family? just because I didn't appreciate a piece of scrap wood? You are sick. I didn't flinch. I reached into the interior pocket of my canvas jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It contained the corporate registration documents, the property titles, and the signed deed to the Harrogate Club. I am not doing this to embarrass my son, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I am doing this to show my son the absolute truth about the woman he shares a home with. I am doing this to show him the monster he is sleeping next to. I tossed the folder onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed across the vast room. Serena looked down at the physical proof of my empire. I watched her eyes closely. I expected to see the final collapse of her pride. I expected to see the devastating realization that she had completely underestimated her target. But that is not what happened. As she stared at the manila folder, the features of her face underwent a terrifying transformation. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, calculating sharpness. Her pupils dilated slightly. The gears inside her mind were violently grinding, recalibrating the mathematics of the situation. She was looking at $34 million in verified assets, and I could see the exact moment she realized that if I possessed that much capital, her plan to declare me legally incompetent wasn't just a way to get rid of a nuisance, it was a winning lottery ticket. She was trying to find an exit strategy. She was searching for a way to manipulate the revelation, to pivot the narrative, and to somehow claim a piece of the vast terrain I had just revealed. I saw the calculation in her eyes, and I felt a dark, absolute certainty settle in my chest. She thought this was the end of the game. She thought the revelation of my wealth was the climax of the confrontation. She had absolutely no idea. Before Serena could open her mouth to launch her newly formulated counterattack, a loud, mechanical clatter echoed from the far end of the hall. The heavy brass-studded main doors of the ballroom swung aggressively open for the second time that afternoon. The heavy brass hardware of the primary entrance yielded with a deep, resonant groan, violently pulling the attention of everyone in the room away from the documents scattered on the mahogany table. Agent Marcus Webb stepped over the threshold. He did not move with urgency or aggression, but with the steady, inescapable momentum of impending consequence. He was flanked by two stoic investigators wearing dark, utilitarian windbreakers. The three federal officers brought an immediate, chilling gravity into the opulent space, but they were not the focal point of the procession. Walking beside Agent Webb was a fragile, 83-year-old woman. Eleanor Briggs wore a sensible, modestly priced navy blue wool coat. Her posture was not hunched or defeated. Her spine was perfectly straight, and she carried her chin with the quiet, enduring dignity of a woman who had survived a lifetime of honest labor. I looked at Agent Webb. He offered a singular, almost imperceptible nod. The 5-day deadline had been honored. Serena turned her head, her calculating expression faltering as she tried to process the intrusion. She looked at the federal agents, her eyes scanning their identifying credentials, and then her gaze drifted to Eleanor. There was no recognition in Serena's eyes. To the daughter-in-law I had grown to despise, the elderly woman standing before her was entirely faceless, just a minor data point in a vast spreadsheet of stolen capital. Ms. Serena Whitfield Calloway, Agent Webb announced, his gravelly voice carrying effortlessly across the vast expanse of the ballroom. We need to have a serious conversation regarding your administrative activities at Whitfield and Associates Insurance. Serena's jaw tightened. The survival instinct that had flared up just moments ago rapidly morphed into a shield of aristocratic indignation. This is an outrageous form of harassment. Serena snapped her voice shrill, attempting to project an authority she no longer possessed. I do not know who let you onto this private estate, but you are trespassing. My legal counsel will have your badges for... She did not get to finish the threat. Eleanor Briggs took a single step forward. It was not an aggressive movement. It was a gentle, deliberate advancement, but it possessed enough unseen weight to instantly silence the younger woman. "Do you recognize me?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was thin, echoing slightly in the grand architecture of the ceiling, but it did not waver. "My name is Eleanor Briggs. I live in the Pinewood district. I sat across from your desk and signed a comprehensive care contract with you 4 years ago." Serena stared at her. Her lips parted slightly, unable to formulate a coherent response. The abstract numbers from her computer screen had suddenly manifested into a living, breathing human being standing on the marble floor. "I walk to the postal office on the 28th of every single month." Eleanor continued, her tone conversational, completely devoid of malice, which somehow made the words cut infinitely deeper. "I mailed a physical check for $390. That money came directly out of my modest retirement pension. I kept my thermostat low in the winter, and I skipped purchasing fresh groceries so I could afford that premium." The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Even the 2 federal investigators seemed to stop breathing. "I did it so that if my health ever failed, my daughter would not be forced to sell her own home to cover my medical expenses," Eleanor said, looking directly into Serena's trembling eyes. "You took $18,720 from me. You used my daughter's safety to buy your clothes, and because of you, if I fall tomorrow, I have absolutely nothing." The devastating simplicity of the statement hung in the air, a profound indictment of extreme moral decay. Eleanor did not cry. She did not raise her voice in anger. The raw, undisputed truth was a weapon far sharper than any shouted insult. Maggie Whitfield took a slow, deliberate step backward. For the very first time since I had met her, the matriarch of the elite family had absolutely nothing to say. As an industry veteran, she understood the catastrophic implications of Agent Webb's presence. The generational reputation of her firm was disintegrating right in front of her, and her immediate, visceral instinct was preservation. She physically distanced herself from her own flesh and blood. Danny stood frozen near the table. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. He looked at the stolen wealth draped across Serena's shoulders, then looked at the worn fabric of Eleanor's coat. The final agonizing piece of the puzzle snapped into place. His entire reality, his marriage, his social climbing, his rejection of his own roots had been entirely financed by the suffering of the most vulnerable people in his community. Agent Webb stepped forward, effectively ending the confrontation. "Serena Whitfield Calloway, you are under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud and elder financial exploitation." Webb recited, his voice a monotonous drone of protocol. One of the investigators moved behind her, securing her wrists. The harsh, metallic ratcheting of the steel cuffs engaging sounded violently out of place among the crystal and mahogany. Panic finally shattered Serena's composure completely. The reality of the federal charges crushed the last remnants of her arrogance. She twisted her upper body, her eyes wide with terror, locking onto her husband. "Danny!" she shrieked, the sound desperate and hollow. "Danny, do something, call the lawyers, say something to them." Danny did not flinch. He did not step forward to intervene. He remained anchored to the floor, staring at her with eyes that looked completely dead. The silence he offered her was the loudest, most absolute judgment a man could pass. The investigators turned her around and began marching her toward the exit. The sound of her expensive heels striking the marble was no longer a rhythmic display of power. It was an erratic, stumbling drag of a defeated prisoner. Maggie Whitfield turned and followed the officers out the door. She did not look back at her daughter, nor did she look at my son. She simply vanished into the afternoon sunlight, abandoning the wreckage. The heavy doors swung shut, plunging the ballroom back into a profound, ringing quiet. Only 4 people remained: myself, Tom Briley Danny and Eleanor Briggs. Eleanor turned slowly toward me. She offered a very slight, respectful nod of her head, a silent acknowledgement that the carpenter had kept his word. I lowered my chin in return, honoring the immense courage she had displayed. I looked at my son. Danny was standing alone in the dead center of the massive room, surrounded by blueprints of a future he had no part in, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He stared at the empty space where his wife had stood just moments prior, utterly unmoored, having absolutely no idea where to look, where to go, or how to begin assembling the shattered fragments of his existence. The massive brass-studded doors clicked shut with a resounding, inescapable finality, sealing away the chaotic aftermath of the federal arrest. Tom Briley had gently guided Eleanor Briggs out through the side corridor moments earlier, ensuring her safe transport back to the modest confines of the Pinewood district. Within minutes, the sprawling, opulent ballroom was entirely empty, save for two men standing in the center of the shattered illusion. The silence that descended upon the room was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum left behind by a rapidly departing storm. Danny did not pace the floor. He did not shout, nor did he demand further explanations regarding the unbelievable wealth currently documented on the table. He simply turned, walked toward one of the high-backed mahogany chairs, and collapsed into it. His descent was utterly uncoordinated, the movement of a man whose internal skeletal structure had abruptly turned to ash. He bent forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees, and buried his face in his trembling hands. I remained standing. I did not rush to comfort him. I did not place a reassuring hand on his shoulder to absorb his pain. True healing requires the infection to be fully exposed to the oxygen, and we had not yet reached the absolute bottom of this particular wound. We existed in that suspended, agonizing quiet for nearly 20 minutes. I stood perfectly still, listening to the ragged, uneven rhythm of his breathing echoing in the vast chamber. I remembered the hoarse, jagged voice from the voicemail playing in the cab of my truck. Just 24 hours earlier, I'm scared. The fear he had expressed then was a mere shadow compared to the absolute devastation radiating from his physical posture now. Finally, Danny slowly lowered his hands. His face was a landscape of pure exhaustion. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, forcing me to step closer just to decipher the syllables. "I knew," he said. The two words were dragged out of his throat, jagged and reluctant, tearing at his vocal cords. "I knew she didn't respect you," Danny continued, his gaze fixed permanently on the polished marble floor between his expensive shoes. "It didn't start with the incident involving the wooden horse, Dad. It started in the very first year we were married. It was never a loud argument. It was 1,000 tiny, lethal cuts." He took a shallow, painful breath, forcing himself to articulate the profound cowardice he had harbored for a half-decade. "It was the way she would sigh in exasperation whenever I mentioned visiting your house on a Sunday." He explained, his voice gaining a fraction of volume. "It was the subtle sneer she would give when you wore your work boots to our first anniversary dinner. It was the way she would introduce you to her corporate colleagues, always quickly adding that you were semi-retired to frantically gloss over the fact that you still worked with your hands. I saw all of it, every single eye roll, every single condescending remark brilliantly disguised as a polite, helpful suggestion." I pulled out a chair directly across from him and sat down. I did not interrupt. I let him bleed out the poison. "She never explicitly demanded that I cut you out of my life." Danny said, his hands clenching into tight fists upon his knees. "She was much smarter and far more insidious than that. She just made it incredibly exhausting to include you. She actively created an environment where every interaction with you became a logistical nightmare, a social hurdle that I had to constantly apologize for." She made it perfectly clear, without ever speaking the actual words, that I had to make a definitive choice. She applied a constant, suffocating pressure. I had to choose the polished, perfect trajectory of the Whitfield family, or I had to choose the carpenter. A single tear broke loose, tracing a slow path through the gray ash of his complexion. And I chose the path of least resistance, Danny confessed, the self-loathing practically vibrating off his skin. I wanted the executive promotions. I wanted the invitations to the exclusive charity galas. I wanted to feel like I belonged in this specific, elevated stratosphere. So I let her push you away. I actively participated in my own father's erasure because it made my daily existence significantly smoother. He finally looked up, meeting my eyes with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. This was the precise emotional core of the wreckage. "Dad, I wasn't tricked," Danny whispered, his voice cracking violently under the monumental weight of the admission. "I tricked myself." The profound tragedy of those words struck the deepest chord in my chest. He was not a victim of a masterful deception. He had been a fully conscious, active accomplice in his own moral compromise. He had sold his integrity on an installment plan. He leaned back against the chair, completely spent. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the distant mechanical hum of the central climate control system. Then, his eyes drifted toward the manila folder still resting on the table, the undeniable physical proof of the $34 million empire. "Why didn't you tell me?" Danny asked. The question was entirely devoid of accusation. It was born of a desperate, childlike confusion. Growing up seeing you work those grueling maintenance shifts, watching you patch your own work boots with tape. Why didn't you just tell me about the assets you could have told me? I looked at the folder, then back at my son. Because extreme wealth is an incredibly dangerous narcotic. I answered, my voice steady, carrying the calm authority of a man who had successfully navigated those treacherous waters. If I had handed you a multi-million-dollar trust fund at 21, or if you had known there was a massive financial safety net waiting to catch you whenever you fell, it would have fundamentally altered your spine. You would have evaluated every relationship, every career choice, and every moral dilemma through the distorting lens of a financial shield. I leaned forward, folding my calloused hands together on the table. I kept the portfolio completely hidden because I wanted to know exactly who you would be without the money, I stated, delivering the hardest, most unyielding truth of the afternoon. I needed to see what kind of man you would become when you had to rely solely on your own character and your own moral compass, and now I know. Danny flinched as if he had been physically struck across the jaw. He dropped his chin to his chest, utterly unable to hold my gaze. The verdict was absolute, and he knew with sickening certainty that he had failed the test spectacularly. I stood up. The air in the ballroom felt too heavily recycled, too thick with the ghosts of Serena's curated lies and my son's crushing regrets. "Walk with me," I commanded softly. Danny obediently pushed himself to his feet. I led him across the vast expanse of the grand hall, pushing open the heavy glass doors that opened onto the rear terrace. The transition from the sterile, engineered interior to the vibrant, sun-drenched exterior provided an immediate shock to the senses. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the meticulously cultivated rose garden. We walked down the winding gravel path in absolute silence until we reached the old, crumbling fieldstone boundary wall at the very edge of the property. "Your mother grew up walking past this land every day on her way to work," I said quietly, looking out at the roses. "She was 20 years old, wearing a faded diner uniform, and she made me promise that one day I would buy her a garden just like this one. I was a broke carpenter with $40 in my pocket. I told her one day I would. I paused, touching the velvet petal of a nearby bloom. She never got to see me keep that promise. But I kept it anyway. I bought this estate because of her, not for the prestige, not for the revenue. Because she deserved a garden, and because some promises don't expire, just because the person you made them to is gone. I turned away from the flowers and pointed back toward the massive, imposing structure of the country club. And now I am tearing it down also for your mother. She was a woman who understood the crushing, terrifying reality of struggling to survive on a fixed income. She would absolutely despise the exclusivity and the staggering arrogance of a country club. She would want this land to become something infinitely more meaningful. Danny slowly turned his head, looking back through the glass doors at the massive blueprints of Briggs Commons still spread across the mahogany table. The vision of the affordable housing complex, the medical center, and the community gardens seemed to finally solidify in his mind. He looked at the legacy of his mother, a legacy built on compassion and sacrifice, standing in stark contrast to the fraudulent, empty life he had just watched burn to the ground. He stood there for a long time, the cool afternoon breeze drying the tear tracks on his face. When he finally spoke, the hesitation and the corporate arrogance were entirely burned away. "Is there anything I can do, Dad?" Danny asked. He didn't sound like a fallen executive anymore. He sounded exactly like the young boy in oversized denim overalls who used to proudly sort galvanized nails in my dusty garage. I looked at my son, observing the profound wreckage of his adult life, but also seeing the cleared, fertile ground left in the wake of the destruction. The toxic structures had been successfully demolished. "That depends entirely on you, Danny," I replied, my voice calm, offering neither immediate forgiveness nor eternal condemnation. "Are you ready to start over from the very beginning?" The crisp, brilliant air of a mid-October morning swept across the western ridge of Crestfield City, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth instead of expensive lemon polish. Exactly 9 months after the absolute demolition of a toxic empire, the grand opening of Briggs Commons commenced under a cloudless sky. The imposing, gated fortress of the country club had been completely erased. In its place stood a sprawling, welcoming residential campus consisting of 120 affordable apartments. The meticulously engineered labyrinth of hybrid tea roses was gone, replaced by a vibrant, slightly chaotic community garden where the new residents had personally planted hydrangeas, sunflowers, and heirloom tomatoes. I stood near the back of the gathered crowd, avoiding the temporary stage and the local press. I watched as Eleanor Briggs, wearing her familiar navy blue coat, gripped an oversized pair of ceremonial scissors. Her daughter stood proudly by her side, wiping tears from her cheeks as the red ribbon fell to the newly paved walkway. Danny stood right beside me. He was not wearing a tailored charcoal suit. He wore a simple faded polo shirt and canvas work pants. For the past 8 months, he had been working as an assistant property manager under Tom Briley, learning the unforgiving mechanics of building maintenance from the ground up. An elderly man carrying a small cardboard box walked past us toward Unit 47. He caught my eye and offered a short, respectful nod. I returned the gesture. Danny watched the exchange, his hands resting in his pockets. "You built all of this from decades of repairing cabinets and fixing leaky pipes." Danny said, his voice quiet, lacking any trace of his former arrogance. "Do you ever regret it? Not living differently, I mean. You could have bought a massive estate, traveled the world, or lived in absolute luxury. I kept my eyes on the community garden. No. I only regret one thing. I deeply regret that I did not have a completely honest conversation with you much sooner." Danny nodded slowly, accepting the weight of the truth. Suddenly, the cellular device in his pocket vibrated. He pulled it out, reading the illuminated screen. His exhausted face instantly flooded with a blinding, terrifying joy. "Dad!" Danny breathed, looking up at me. "It's time. The baby is coming." Hours later, the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of the municipal hospital felt like the center of the universe. I stood outside the maternity ward, looking through the large viewing window. On the other side of the glass, Danny was sitting in a standard hospital chair, awkwardly but tenderly cradling a tiny, swaddled bundle against his chest. William Robert Calloway had entered the world. Watching my son press his forehead against the newborn's fragile head, the immense, decades-long circle finally closed. The cycle of arrogance and extraction had been broken, replaced by a foundation built on labor, humility, and genuine love. Late that evening, I returned to my empty house. I did not go to the kitchen. I walked straight out to the detached garage, flipping on the single overhead bulb. The familiar scent of pine dust wrapped around me like an old friend. I walked to the very back shelf and reached for the small, chunky, roughly hewn wooden horse I had carved in the freezing winter of 1998. I ran my calloused thumb over the faint, dark stain on the mane where my own blood had seeped into the timber. I carried the carving inside and sat down at the kitchen table, placing a small cardboard box and a roll of heavy wrapping paper in front of me. I looked up at the faded photograph on the wall. "My love," I whispered into the quiet room. "I am giving the very first one to Will, not to sit on a dusty shelf, but to do exactly what it did for our boy, to pull someone back out of the dark." I picked up a pen and wrote a final simple message on a small manila tag, tying it securely to the wooden ear. "For Will, from Grandpa Bob. Made with love, just like you." Looking back at this family story, I realize my deepest regrets. Don't be like me. Don't hide the truth in silence just to test the morality of the people you love. It is a dangerous game that almost cost me my son. Only God knows how much time we truly have left to guide our children before the world corrupts them. In my personal view, wealth without character is nothing but a heavy golden anchor. A true legacy is only built through honest labor, calloused hands, and unconditional love. I share these grandpa stories, hoping that my personal scars can prevent your future mistakes. Every family story has its dark chapters, but it is never too late to tear down the rotten structures and rebuild a much stronger foundation. If you found a piece of yourself in this family story, please leave a comment below. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful journeys. I know there are many places you can go for grandpa stories, so I am incredibly grateful you chose to listen to mine. I hope these grandpa stories continue to bring you value and perspective. Thank you so much for staying with me and watching until the very end. Please be advised, some of our upcoming narratives will contain fictional elements carefully constructed for educational purposes. If you prefer strictly non-fiction content, please feel free to click away and choose another video that better suits your preferences.